I'm an Agile Coach. I work mainly in the Netherlands. And the last couple of years, I've been spending most of my time getting companies to adopt continuous delivery and continuous deployment. One of the things that every one of those companies struggles with is how to approach testing with that. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Now, partly this talk was inspired by the fact that a tester that was working in one of the teams I was working with gave a presentation actually at the Agile Testing Days last year. And he was talking about the role of the tester, like in the history, waterfall, Agile. And then he based his discussion of continuous delivery on his experiences in my team. And he characterized that with the picture of a dodo. So that was something that generated a little discussion at that conference. And most of that discussion, I think, was caused by the fact that there's still very few people that actually are working in this way. So everything is very unfamiliar. So let's start with something that is familiar. Everyone knows about the testing pyramid? Yeah? Okay. So the testing pyramid was introduced basically because most people were doing the exact inverse of this, right? So it's an answer to an existing situation, and it has caused a few problems in that way. At the XP conference in May, there was an extensive panel that discussed the meaning of the testing pyramid, and whether it was still a useful tool. And there were lots of people that knew what they were talking about. There was Elizabeth Hendrickson, Uncle Bob was there, David Evans, Matt Wynn, I think. So there was a lot of people that had very clear opinions about this, and I really knew what they were saying. Still, the discussion ended up mostly in the familiar parable of the elephant. So everyone had a different opinion on what was important in the testing pyramid and how you should interpret that. And I do think that, and I'll get back to that during the talk, I do think that there's some harm done by oversimplification. Of course, that is kind of the point of a model. You have to simplify to be able to apply it. And if you don't, you have to make things complicated. So this may be a better testing pyramid. Because every time you start looking at part of it, you need to get into more detail. And there's more ifs and buts, and if this and then that and everything. So before you know it, you're actually in a testing fractal, which is not going to help us discuss this at all. Well, a little maybe, because the continuous delivery fast cycle may be the CPU cycles that you need to actually calculate the fractal. And if you do it well, and if you do it fast, sometimes you get very beautiful results. But let's get back to some practical business. Who here does TDD in their teams? That's pretty much, I think, par for the course. 20–25% is doing TDD. This is one of my pain points throughout my career as an Agile coach. It's very hard to get people to adopt one of the basic testing practices, one of the basic practices of XP in my case. And you have to remember, this is an Agile conference. And still we don't get more than 20–25%. And that's the same at every Agile conference. So, so adoption of TDD has been difficult. if you look at the, well, let me put it this way. Who here is familiar with the phrase, it's done, all I have to do is write the unit tests? Right? Yeah. So usually, this is usually something that people say during a stand-up, and then they still have to write the unit test. That happens at the end of the sprint, and then everything turns out not to be as done as they thought it would be, or the unit tests are never written at all. It's a familiar problem, and it's also, in a nutshell, I think, why I really like continuous delivery. Because basically, if you're going to be pushing that code into source control and 10 minutes later it's going to be on production, or if you're careful, 10 minutes later it should be able to be delivered to production, then you really cannot delay the writing of the unit tests. And I've seen this happen again and again. As a coach, you work with the team, you explain them how unit testing should work, how you should test drive your code. People actually like it, but they don't actually start doing it. And what I've seen multiple times now with teams that were very explicitly wanting to move towards continuous delivery is that the moment that we flipped the switch, the moment that we said, okay, from now on, every time you push, it's going into production, the whole problem disappeared. And TDD was being used, tests were being written, test coverage was kept high. In fact, the first couple of teams I did this with themselves insisted that their delivery pipeline would would break the moment that the test coverage dropped below 100%. At that point, I actually advised them not to do that because I was of the opinion that there's a danger of messing around with coverage figures. It's very hard to get to an actual 100%. You probably should give yourself some slack there. I've changed my opinion there because as soon as they started saying, okay, no, it's going to be 100%, and if it breaks, we're going to fix it, then we still had situations where it was impossible to test a particular type of code, like some generated code that was necessary for a framework, for instance, that your own code will never access. It's very hard to test that, and it's usually only getters and setters. So we still had places where the coverage would drop, and every time that happened, the build would break. We would discuss, is this a case where we think it's valid that there is no test covering it? Yes, then we can ignore it. And then you annotate it. But you get a completely different type of discussion. Instead of that, okay, we should, we were aiming for like 75%. You never know when you're in trouble and when you're not. And by forcing yourself to stick to the 100%, you actually force yourself to have the discussion, which type of code do we test and which do we not test. So it's been very interesting to see how that flip happens exactly at the moment where you remove the safety net. If we look at another one of our basic practices, and I do know that this is not specific to continuous delivery, it's just that they seem to reinforce each other very nicely. But acceptance test-driven development is another one of our basic XP practices, so we know it, or maybe it's specification by example nowadays, or you can call it BDD, or I don't care. Is anyone doing that? 10–15%. That's actually higher than what I normally see. Okay, so that's good. So we basically have the same issue there, right? It's kind of accepted as a core practice that has major effects on quality, but adoption is slow. Certainly adoption in the original XP sense of the word, where we write our customer tests, we automate them test by test, and actually complete them test by test. And interestingly enough, that's one of the things that also starts happening when we are in continuous delivery or continuous deployment mode. So if you're doing BDD, what you're supposed to be doing is you have your tester and your developer and your business and whoever else is involved, your three amigos. You discuss your user stories, you discuss your scenarios, and you start making acceptance criteria, acceptance scenarios that you will be automating to see whether the complete functionality that you want is covered. Right? That's the goal of those type of tests. What you see happening when you are working with continuous delivery is that the iterative aspect of that, which is usually out of view when agile teams adopt this, becomes much more important. Which means that we actually write those scenarios, and every time a development pair and a tester, they pick up one of the scenarios, they discuss how they will be testing this, how they will hook up the scenario with the code. And keep in mind, if you do this right, that is not through the UI in like 95% of the cases. But they discuss how that will be hooked up into the code. And while the developers start implementing that, the tester will actually look at those scenarios and look for edge cases and look for additional data sets so that he can get a feel that the code that they're writing is actually safe, which is not an acceptance type of thing, but is definitely something that very easily hooks into the technology that you use for this. And then they can, scenario by scenario, push that stuff into production. Maybe behind a feature toggle, maybe not, depending on what type of functionality we're talking about. But definitely incrementally release that into production. And when that happens, and I'm going to skip a few slides. When it happens, the tester can actually start testing these type of scenarios manually. It's not that there is no manual testing necessary. You never know beforehand exactly what will go wrong. So you need to do exploratory testing. And you can do that scenario by scenario, and you can do that in production. And this is usually the place where, when I introduce this to my teams, I get a little discussion, because that can be a little scary. But that is the point where we remove the safety net, right? Up until the point where you say, okay, up until the point where you say our automated checks are good enough that we all will be going into production if they pass, there is still a safety net. And oddly enough, the discussion, there's always some discussion with the testers, but there's much more discussion with the developers. Because the testers, they are the safety net, but the developers, they depend on the safety net. So this is usually a scary point, and there's always a lot of discussion, a lot of hand wringing. We got to the point where we said, okay, so every time at the end of the sprint. We have all of this stuff done. We have it tested. We still do these manual checks, right? What do they deliver us? What kind of problems do we find when we do the manual test? And the answer is always, yeah, we always find issues, which is what I would expect. We always find issues. But the issues that were being found for most of these teams, for a couple of months, they'd only found very small issues. Some small layout issues, which were not covered, of course, by the automated tests. Sometimes small functional issues, but never anything that would actually have an impact on the bottom line. And the whole point is that if you do manual testing, you will always find new problems. You never have a perfect system. So you have to make you have to weigh what the effect is of the manual testing and weigh that against the delay in getting things into production. But most importantly, every time that you make that decision, that you remove the safety net, the complete culture of the team changes overnight. I've now, in the past 4 years, there's been 5 companies that I've been doing this with. One of them is not there yet; I'm still working on it. But in all the other ones, it was very clear that that was the point that was the important switch to make. And so that's why, if it's at all possible, I actually encourage people to move towards continuous deployment, not just continuous delivery. The difference between those two is continuous delivery. You say that I'm always able to go to production at any time. So all I have to do is press a button. In continuous deployment, you remove the button. That's the difference. But it's it's a very small difference, and it should not have any impact in how you do things, but it does. So I was lying. The tester is not the only safety net, of course, that the team has. There's another one, which is the operations engineer. He's the guy that gets called at 3 a.m. because someone thought it was a good idea to schedule 3 batch jobs at the same time. He's any operations people here? No? You're an operator? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you. I've been a developer for a long time, and those are definitely the people that save your bacon. Anyway, the interesting thing is, of course, that a very important part of what an operations engineer does is writing checks to see whether the system is performing within accepted parameters. You might call that tests if you want to, and those are often different types of tests. I mean, he'll also check whether the system is filling up the hard drive in an increased rate, which is probably not what the first thing that a tester or a development team will think of. But they're tests nonetheless. And one of the things that what you see is that, well, the movement, the buzzword of continuous delivery, and that of DevOps are going hand in hand, and that's necessary. There is no way that you can move that quickly and deploy that often without having operations people in your team. And as soon as you start having those in your team, it becomes logical to actually combine the skills of a tester and of a developer, of course, but with that of the operations guy. And actually, I've seen this happen a couple of times where as soon as those two start actually talking together, the type of tests that operations can hang into something like Nagios or whatever monitoring tool they're using is extended. So there's always loads of low-level tests in there, but now the tester can say, okay, oh wait, we actually have a test that tests that, and they can hang much higher level tests into the monitoring system, which helps in operations because then you can actually judge when you're awoken at 3 o'clock in the morning whether this is actually something that needs to be fixed and has a big business impact or it doesn't. So in that way, those really enrich each other. Good. Okay, so wonderful talk about that from Liz Coe, article, which I really recommend. She discusses this as being continuous capabilities that you are monitoring. And it is interesting to see that some companies are investing heavily in this type of monitoring and testing combination. Companies like Booking.com in Holland, or The Guardian, who have been doing away with the various types of their end-to-end and UI testing, and actually depend on automated user-level tests that are monitored in the system, both continuously on production and during things like canary releases. It's an interesting approach. I have not done it in that at that level yet. So going back a few, as I was saying earlier, the testing pyramid has had a few effects, and one of them is definitely oversimplification. We have unit tests, we have our service tests and UI tests. The danger and the effect that I've seen in many teams of that is that is actually exactly what people implement, right? So they have unit tests, could be real unit tests, could be more like component tests if they're not doing TDD. And they have high-level tests, sometimes those are the same thing. They have integration tests and they have UI tests, and there is no further distinction between them. And if you think about your testing in that way, that can be very limiting. And you see many companies that actually do think about the testing in that way. And they usually end up with test sets that get slow and get brittle and actually impede their delivery pipeline. You cannot have a continuous delivery if your pipeline takes 6 hours to run all your integrated tests. So, this is actually I think a major obstacle that is kind of caused by the testing pyramid, or at least by a simplistic interpretation of it. And I really recommend that people look at how they can split up their testing. Basically, what you need to do is use the normal concepts of software engineering, separation of concerns in this particular case, and apply them to your test set. So you don't have one set of integration tests, for instance, but you have tests that test different types of functionality for your system, So you have a test that does, for instance, you have an actual component test that tests whether, perhaps your microservice, the response contains contains the results that you would expect for a certain input, right? So that's an actual fairly high-level component test for a microservice. That particular test will not test whether that result is returned in the right way. In fact, that particular test preferably will not need the service to be running in any type of environment. It will simply talk to the APIs that are underneath your protocol. And you'll have separate tests that actually test whether the protocol is correct. So where the results are put in the right form. If you have those type of tests, it also becomes easier, for instance, to work with versioned interfaces. That was mentioned in the previous talk. There were some questions about that. If you have versioned interfaces, then you also want to know which version works with which client. That should be independent on the functionality of the actual component. So it's a separate concern. So it's a separate type of tests. And an integration test is not a test that runs the whole system end-to-end. An integration test tests whether component X can talk to component Y. And is probably something that actually does require those systems to be running and may actually be more of a test of the infrastructure than, and the configuration than of the component itself. So if you have different concerns that you're testing for, then have separate tests for each of those concerns. What regularly happens is that we have one big test that has dependencies on all of those different types of concerns, and if the test fails, one of those concerns is has a problem, but we don't necessarily know which one, and then basically the test is not specific enough. So there is a wonderful article, actually presentation, on Martin Fowler's website. Most everything that anyone has ever thought of in software engineering is on Martin Fowler's website, so it's if you want to waste a week, go ahead. But this is actually very useful. That presentation or that explanation says it's about microservices. That's really nonsense. It's about any type of system that has an interface, and does a wonderful job of explaining that. So I would definitely recommend having a look at that if you want to get control over your testing. So, problem, of course, for all of that is that it's not really new, right? Sorry, it's not really new. Basically, all the things that I've been talking about right now is anything that a high-functioning agile team should be at least worrying about. And the difference when we're talking about continuous delivery is that if you don't, you are going to fail very, very quickly. And I think that's the reason, again, that I really love continuous delivery. It forces us to, I think that, what was his name? Paul this morning. There you go. Yeah, you were saying that you've kind of been moving towards a process that you would call XP. I think I agree. For me, continuous delivery is the thing that finally allows me to do XP with my clients. And all the things that that were scary or too difficult and that people have been skipping and then calling it Scrum are no longer an option to skip. So, for me, that's a good thing. Still, though, there are some things that I don't think we've been doing normally in Agile, and that are fairly new and up and coming, and that are, either required or encouraged by CD or made possible. One of them is infrastructure tests. I have not myself been successful yet in actually test driving the infrastructure. Done a few smaller scale experiments with that. And this particular tool set is still very much in development. Let's put it that way. But it is very much in development, and there is like every couple of months, the new options become available. But certainly, tools like Chef and Puppet, which are often used for deployment automation, they now have pretty good built-in unit testing support, where you don't need to have the full environment up and running to actually run some tests on your configuration and on its internal consistency. Some of those tools actually allow you to run the same tests against the deployed system, so you can extend that into monitoring the infrastructure. But certainly, actually, the more infrastructure becomes code, the more the lack of testing that we actually have there becomes an issue. And the better teams are certainly at least writing their Nagios checks in lockstep with any new deployment code. But this is an area where, I think, in the next year or so, we'll be seeing a lot of new possibilities. But as I said, I can't talk too much from experience there. So the other one that I have experience with is business tests. Who knows the concept of an MVP? Right. So who's using that as something else than a milestone? Right. It's the concept of an MVP was introduced by Eric Ries in his Lean Startup book, and it's a great idea. Most of the time, where people are using the name, they actually are talking about, we have a first milestone that we're okay with releasing, which is not what it's about. It's actually a test. An MVP is supposed to be a test on, do we actually want to develop this functionality? And some people have been calling this, so hypothesis-driven development, which is too hard to pronounce. I mean, certainly too hard to pronounce if you're not a native speaker. So, but it is an interesting concept. What I've done with one of my clients that was very far along on the continuous delivery part. They were actually deploying 30 times a day and all that. That was working fine. And at that point, if that motor is running smoothly, it becomes harder for the business to keep up. And also, what I was noticing is that the development team were actually getting much more. They were much more involved in monitoring the system. They were building dashboards for what kind of business results the website was getting, and they started to, well, I won't say revolt, but they actually started to give targeted feedback to the PO about which features should be prioritized. And what we started doing is, instead of putting a feature on the backlog, is simply putting a business goal on the backlog. Increase the number of relevant jobs that applicants see. That was actually a business target. And there's different ways of doing that. There's different ways of measuring that. And we would do in a week 5 or 6 different experiments and those would be something that you'd build in a day or so, put live, measure what the result was, give to a certain part of your customers, measure what the result is. And if the result is clearly positive, then that perhaps is a feature that we should spend a couple of weeks building in all detail. That kind of flexibility in testing those types of hypotheses is something that you only get if you actually have the capability to very cheaply release that test, do that experiment. I know someone gave a talk today about landing pages. I'm sorry I missed that. There was a conflict. But that doesn't always work, right? So there's definitely lots of functionality that you actually need to do some code for. But it doesn't have to be much. And in the team that I did this particular experiment with, we actually got to the point where fairly large features, like chunks of development that were going to take 6 to 8 weeks for 2 teams, were cancelled because of a couple of days of experiment. So this in the end is why we want to do continuous delivery, why we want to have that kind of control, why we want to make it so cheap to deploy something, because it also becomes cheap to then throw it away again and not look at it any further. So those are the, and I think that's the main goal for me that I want to achieve with this. All the technical parts are important because without it you simply can't do these things. That was pretty much what I wanted to talk about. I'm going to stop my timer. Otherwise we'll get an alert. Any questions? No questions. I was completely clear. Oh, all the way in the back.
Thanks for sharing that. You said, you made the point that this drives, CG in effect drives the XP process. You said over sort of 4 years, 5 companies removing the safety net, you've seen some of the cultural changes. I'm just curious about what those changes felt and looked like.
What they felt like is the discussion about, I've had many teams where there was a lot of discussion about should we write a unit test for this, for instance, and how many tests should we have? What level should the test coverage be? Those kind of discussions completely disappeared and were replaced by discussions with the developers and the testers about, yeah, so yes, we have this tested, but I've got a feeling that there's a gap in our testing strategy. So we have the unit tests over here, and they do this level of testing. We have integration tests over there. We have the protocol test. But over here somewhere in the client code for our services, there's a chunk that we aren't reaching. Or part of our build process is not completely tested. We can deploy something. It can functionally be complete, but our build process can make sure that, for instance, the CSS isn't compiled, the less code isn't compiled to CSS, which can completely make our website completely useless. And we don't have a test for that. So how can we, and that it started to be not about am I reaching the level of agreed test coverage, but it started about we want the system to work in any way, and we want to have control about it, complete control over it, and we think we're getting there, but we still need this and this and this to make it perfect. And it's never perfect, of course, but and that is lots of testers talk about a quality mindset. And they usually talk about it in a way that is about the fact that it's missing in the minds of developers. Because that's also part of their identity, and that's fine. But I think that's exactly what we're talking about. The removal of the safety net, the very clear fact of being responsible for the system is what we feel. Anything else?
What does the business think of when you're removing the safety net in the organization? Because they're usually saying, I want end-to-end test and blah, blah, blah.
They usually react a little scared. But in the better organizations, they actually trust their testers and developers if they think this is a valid choice. But also, usually the business is confused about the moment of deployment and the moment of release, and thinks that those two are the same thing, which is where things like feature toggles and those kind of things surface. So the fact that we are deploying continuously does not mean that our customers get the functionality continuously. They may only get that functionality, on Christmas Day, because that's when it becomes important. And while it's not Christmas Day yet, our business and our testers and everyone can access the functionality on production and test it as they wish. And as soon as they find that out and if they figure that out, then it's usually okay. Okay. Thank you.